So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Caspian podcast with me, Mark Elliott. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to have Professor James Ker-Lindsay. Now, with his academic hat on, he's a visiting professor at LSE and a lot of other places. But what's particularly amazing is you managed to combine that with a YouTube star status. And I have to say, if you haven't seen his videos on YouTube, get them. Now, what he concentrates on is new states or the foundation of states on conflicts, and they are absolutely brilliant. So if you're looking for a video that sums up in about 10 or 15 minutes the essence of a problem, that's the place to go. Now, enough blowing your trumpet. Welcome, James. And how long have you been doing these videos?
Thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, I started, I guess, sort of coming up for about 1.5 years now. Yeah, I still don't quite know why I started, to be honest with you. But it's something that now I'm doing them. I'm hooked. It's a lot of work though. But
well,
yeah,
I think yes, I think people. This is one of the things I can't believe, because quite often something's in the news, and before I know it, you've popped up a video on it, and I think, well, there's so much. And for people that haven't seen your videos, it's absolutely packed with well-balanced background. So you have all these sort of knowledge that you need to get the background, and yet there's sort of, it's really up to date and everything. Now, I was just also wondering though, as an academic, when I did my master's in an international relations field, there was this sort of sense that if you made things too popular or too real world, that was almost something bad. Now, how does that work for you as a professor and a YouTuber?
Well, do you know what, Mark, that's absolutely why I was so interested in doing this, because I remember when I was doing my postgraduate studies, I mean, there we were learning all these sort of theories, concepts, but we did remarkably little in terms of trying to apply it to what was going on at the world at the time. And, you know, I was doing my master's in 93, 94. So this was an immediate post-Cold War period. You know, there was so many interesting developments. You know, we were thinking about what the world was going to be in the future. And yet, you know, we were doing these classes, and yet there was no real attempt to try and discuss what was going on. And I think that's always stayed with me. So although, you know, I have a very clear academic background, I've actually done a lot of policy work over the years. I've worked in think tanks as well. I've worked in private consulting. You know, so I think this is really, this is very much an offshoot of it. And look, I know some academics sort of turn their nose up at this sort of thing and, you know, just want to do their theoretical stuff. But, you know, I've always felt it's incredibly important, you know, when talking to students and sort of providing that real world example. And so this is just really an offshoot of that, of sort of saying, well, look, you know, a conflict has broken out in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. What's it about? But what are the historical roots of it? And also, what can we relate in terms of sort of broader ideas? So concepts of like secession or elements of international law. How do those relate in? But I do it very, very light, as you know. I mean, I don't sort of go in and give a 20-minute lecture on, you know, theories of secession. I sort of just try and preface it with saying, look, when we talk about secession, this is the sort of thing that we're interested in. And here's a really great real world example that's taking place at the moment that, you know, illustrates this point. Yeah. So I really do try and do that.
And again, just one of the wonderful things you did, I think back last year, was a sort of your top 20, as it were, top 20 conflicts and possible new states. And that's, you know, again, that's a really interesting thing. And I mean, I was astounded at some of your choices, like Ambazonia. I've actually been to Bamenda in the Cameroons, which is in Ambazonia, without even realizing that this was going to be the case. I mean, that was a few years ago. But now, what's interesting for us, particularly as with the Caspian podcast, is that several of your top 20 do impact our region. And one of the clear-cut examples which you pointed out was, I should point out that you quite rightly predicted the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. But one of your top 20 was the Abkhazia conflict, and you chose to look at that rather than South Ossetia. So I just, you know, can you, now I know you're a specialist particularly in Southeast Europe, and that you've you've even taught in Pristina University, if I'm right, or have I got that right?
Yes, yes. In fact, across the region, So you're absolutely right. Southeast Europe is my traditional area that I started off in, but so many of the issues there, and again, it's grown out of it. But you're right. I mean, I've had an interest in what's been going on in the Caucasus precisely because of these de facto states and these breakaway territories.
So what I'd be very interested is your views as a Southeast, because for me, and we brought this up in another podcast, but the Kosovo seems to me an absolutely crucial moment for the Caucasus. And I just wondered if you as the sort of Southeast Asia expert, Southeast Europe expert, might just...
I did almost start off as Southeast Asia, but that's another story for another time.
But could you just because I think that might be something interesting that maybe falls between the gaps here. How is Kosovo so important, and what is the sort of interlinking influences that you see?
Look, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that element of Kosovo is very interesting and very important, and it's always been played down. That there's a link between what happened in Kosovo at the start of 2008 when it declared independence, it unilaterally declared independence, and then what we saw that took place in Georgia in August that year. And, policymakers have always been very clear to try and differentiate between the two. But as far as Russia has been concerned, it always saw a link and actually used the Kosovo case very clearly to justify what it did with Georgia. But it did so in a way that's actually really, really interesting and fascinating, because people would say, well, if it's using the Kosovo case, why hasn't it recognized Kosovo? Well, we know that there's the quid pro quo. It's not going to recognize Kosovo unless it can get the United States to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And we know that's not going to happen. So we have a stalemate. But Moscow used a much more subtle trick in many ways of saying, turning the foundations of law as we understand it in Britain and the United States as precedent to justify its decision, which I thought was really, really quite interesting, fascinating, scary in a strange sort of way that it did it. But simply said, well, look, you've decided to do this. We don't agree with what you've done there, but you've set a precedent. And because you decided to bypass the Security Council to recognize Kosovo, and whatever reasons you felt you had to do it, the same applies to us. And I remember really thinking quite clearly at the time and writing on this that I was very worried about the Kosovo precedent, not necessarily because I oppose Kosovo having independence. I mean, the reality is I work a lot on secessionist movements. I have a certain degree of sympathy for people who want to pursue independence. So that wasn't the basis of my opposition. What I really did worry about was that the move on Kosovo had been snarled up in the Security Council, and then Britain, France, United States said, well, okay, we are going to bypass the Security Council. And we have our own reasons for doing it. And we're going to say this is a sui generis case in international law. It falls outside the boundaries of the usual, and that justifies it. And I remember thinking at the time, this is really dangerous because this is going to open the way for all sorts of other countries around the world to make the same sorts of arguments. And Russia and the Caucasus was a really obvious one. But of course, we can make the argument that China could potentially do the same in various cases. Other big countries could do the same looking ahead into the future. So I was always really worried about it. But policymakers drew a very clear distinction between the two, or so I thought. And that was one of the things that I found so interesting in your recent interview with Matt Breiser from the State Department, where he was quite open about discussing that they'd actually looked at the possible knock-on effect of Kosovo on the Caucasus and had essentially come to the conclusion that it would inevitably have an effect. So I'm sure your viewers can draw the implications of that thinking for themselves. But for me, who'd spent so long looking at Kosovo and hearing these official policy pronouncements, I think I can fairly say that was a jaw-dropping moment
Yeah, well,
when I heard him say it.
As I think I said in that interview with Matt, I had been in Brussels and we were attending meetings amongst people concerned with the Caucasus, going, well, hang on, if we recognise Kosovo, there's bound to be a war in or at least some major geopolitical knock-on in the Caucasus, and essentially, I remember it not being, will it happen? It's just, will it be Abkhazia? Will it be South Ossetia? Will it be Karabakh? It was sort of almost like, or can we just stop this nonsense? Now, what do you think? Okay, so that they went ahead. What do you have an opinion? And having been in Kosovo, seeing from the other side, was there really was it worth it?
I think if we're to be honest, the knock-on effects have been, notwithstanding what we're talking about on the Caucasus, but more broadly have probably been less than we expected, but they haven't been as positive for Kosovo as I think certainly people in Kosovo would have hoped, and certainly countries like Britain, France, the United States would have hoped. I think their sense was, look, we're big players in international politics, we'll force this through, we've got just good justification in our mind, we can't see an alternative. If we try and put Kosovo back under Belgrade's rule, even under the loosest form of autonomy, the chances are it's going to lead to new conflict. And if we don't leave and we don't give Kosovo independence, then we could face very serious consequences in terms of an uprising. And that then becomes very difficult for us to explain to our populations why we intervene to help people in Kosovo, and now they're turning against us. So I think that was actually a really interesting lesson about intervention. Even if it was done for the best possible reasons, the longer term consequences of this, which essentially put these countries in a position they couldn't move forward, they couldn't move back. Well, we'll create a new model. But the risk, as we've already noted, is that then becomes a model that other countries can adopt. Yeah. And again, to preface all of this or postscript all of this by saying, look, I spend a lot of time in Belgrade, I spend a lot of time in Pristina. I understand why the Serbs feel that they were singled out on this, that what happened with Kosovo really isn't anything that we've seen in any other cases. But on the other hand, having spent time in Pristina, one can see that really, it made a lot of practical sense for Kosovo to become independent. So, it's a difficult one.
And I'm just thinking now, just to bring it back to the Abkhazia case, so that those problems remain for Kosovo. Would you say Abkhazia has very much a mirror problem, or I was left with the idea that you were saying in your videos about Abkhazia that again, they're a little bit stuck. Would they less stuck than Kosovo?
No, I think more. What's been interesting is that there was, I think what we saw happen with Abkhazia and South Ossetia was fascinating. And I think it actually had a very interesting knock-on effect in Crimea, potentially. I realise Crimea is a slightly different case in a number of ways. But Kosovo declared independence, was recognised by Britain, France, United States, and then most of the European Union. And then they really threw their diplomatic leverage behind trying to persuade countries to recognise, to the point that Serbia's managed to persuade a few countries to drop its recognition. It would argue that, Russia also helped on that. But we're talking roughly around 100 countries now recognise Kosovo. Whereas with the case of Abkhazia, it's five or six?
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult to tell. Was it Vanuatu or
now Vanuatu? Yeah, I think so. It was Niue.
Yeah, it was just some really, really weird. And I think that was probably quite embarrassing for Russia. Because one thing we know from recognition is that probably the most important thing you can have if you're a breakaway territory is great power support. And this really highlighted, it can't get you over the line to UN membership. As we've seen, Russia and China are stopping Kosovo from joining. But you've got 100 countries that recognized a territory that had unilaterally declared independence, which in the past was a complete no-no. Whereas Russia's attempts to persuade countries to recognize Abkhazia turned up, as I say, 5 or 6, of which, 2 or 3 were South Pacific Island states. So I think that, in some ways that probably helped reduce that element of the knock-on effect of the Kosovo effect. But it also, I wonder if it had an effect, for example, on Crimea, because then it made the option of, when Crimea declared independence, for Russia to recognize it and then persuade other countries to recognize it, a less attractive option. And Moscow instead went for a far more worrying development in international law, which was annexation. And looking at the Caucasus, I mean, this is the big question. We don't quite know what's going to happen with Abkhazia. I mean, I think there is a general sense that it can be regarded as a de facto state. But there has been a long-term assumption that essentially South Ossetia, maybe the long-term Russian goal is annexation there. So, I think that this may be a bit of a double-edged sword, this whole question of recognition, and that Moscow wasn't nearly as successful in getting countries to recognize Abkhazia as it would have wanted.
Now, one of the things in South Ossetia is the slightly shifting border issue, and that brings us to the question of border demarcations. Now, you did, again, an absolutely splendid job, I thought, in your video about Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, of highlighting the truly crazy borders. Now, I know this is probably a bit not so much your standard area, but again, you managed to wheel out one of the most comprehensive and accurate and up-to-date reports, I thought, on that issue just days after it was happening. And I just honestly wondered, how do you do it? What's your source of information? How do you manage to do that? Because honestly, anyone that wants to look into that Tajik-Kyrgyz conflict, look at your video, because that was excellent. No, sorry. Where did you get it?
Thanks so much for for bigging it up like that. I mean, do you know what? I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the fact that I have an academic research background, which means that and also working consulting, where you've got to work quite quickly, and also having a really keen interest in policy matters. I think in some ways it's actually easier for me to do situations that I'm less familiar with than the ones that I know a lot about, because then I'm much more questioning about, does this information need to be included or not? Whereas with countries that I'm not very familiar about, I go in and I just sweep up, and I'm pretty good now at judging what is a good source. And that's the academic training, if you like. It's sort of, right, okay, is this a credible source? Right, okay, I can put that in the pile, and then cross-checking. I love to go through old UN documents, and there are so many reports. A lot of my Africa stuff, I'm digging up documents which probably haven't been accessed for 30, 40 years. They're all online, but nobody's probably reading them, and scouring those. And I set myself a word limit, and then really try and think, right, okay, as an outsider, what seems to be the important issue here, and piecing it together, but making sure I use really good quality sources wherever possible. So I think that, but it is working quickly, I think is the tough thing. It's, over the course of 2 or 3 days to write a script can sometimes be quite challenging. I usually have a few tucked away in a file for if something comes up that week, which means I just don't have time to write something new. So I do try and have a few there, sort of in the sin bin.
Well, and just for probably the most important thing to our listeners is the Karabakh issue, which comes again and again and again. And so we, in a sense, again, what I thought you did extremely well. You in 2020 you gave us 3 different videos, and there may have been more, but you gave us one in July, sort of saying, hey, you think this is frozen, but be careful. Then, just as it broke out, you gave us, well, basically, who has the right to what? And I thought that, again, that was extremely balanced, which is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I've been writing about Azerbaijan for years, and however you phrase things, someone's going to think you're against them. But I thought you managed that very well. And then at the end of it, you sort of, well, what's happened? But that you did in November. So just, again, you managed to get that out 3 days after the agreement, which was incredible. So I'm just wondering, sort of 6 months on from that, or 8 months on from that, what's your take now on the situation in Karabakh? We weren't quite sure what was happening. Still not quite sure. But what's your gut feeling as an observer of such things?
Do you know, it's such an interesting question of what now, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's on my to-do list. I'd like to do another video on it to follow up, because and again, relating to the big concept issues that I like to do, I'm fascinated with the concept of de facto state. And we thought of Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto state. Now, people will often say, well, de facto states have patrons in almost all cases, so they could actually be regarded better as a case of occupation. And, that was always the standard Azerbaijani argument for Nagorno-Karabakh. It's not a de facto state, it's Armenian occupied territory. We see this in Cyprus. I mean, this is very much the Greek Cypriot line, that it's not a de facto Turkish Cypriot state, it's Turkish occupied territory. And so we thought of Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto state, but of course, what is it now? Is it still a de facto state? And there's all sorts of arguments, legal arguments about, a state is defined by having defined territory, a settled population, governance, and the ability to enter into international relations. And potentially it could still do that, but it exists by grace of Russia. So I'm really caught on how to describe it. And I think it's going to be one of these videos I occasionally try and do where I actually ask people a question. What is it? What is it now? I as I say, I can see both sides of the argument, but I may be leaning a bit more to thinking, I think we might now have moved into Russian protectorate territory rather than Armenian de facto state territory.
Yes, well, I know President Ilham Aliyev went on record as saying Nagorno-Karabakh no longer exists, although actually, historically speaking, it hasn't technically existed from the Azerbaijani perspective since 91 or end of 1990, when it was abolished. And I think, but then you have to ask the question, well, if it isn't, then what are the Russians protecting? So I think and I again, in one of your last videos, you pointed out that at the moment, Azerbaijan sort of needs to celebrate its victory, and you had said that they'll be judged by how many people suffer, how many people die. And although it was a war, I have to say, as seen from my perspective, it seemed like it was done extraordinarily well. If you're going to do a war, it was a fairly well-run war, and relatively minimal casualties. Is that seen from your point of view? Do you see it like that, or do you think that the whole idea of the war happening at all, should it still have been a negotiated settlement?
I mean, by inclination, I always believe that, it's far better to have a negotiated settlement. But I mean, it really did raise a fascinating point, because we are used to the idea of negotiated settlements. But of course, sovereignty also means that, these territories that break away, there is always the possibility that the parent state, as we use the term, will decide that they're just going to retake it. And I think, it's fascinating to see how that works in certain circumstances and how it doesn't. So, for example, Kosovo is a really good example of Serbia saying, you know what, we've had enough with this insurgency. We're going in, we're going to try and take it back and bring it back under our control. And obviously that was rejected. Whereas there have been cases like this where the world essentially sits back and says, if you make this quick enough, we'll let you just get on with it. And in many ways, what we saw happen in Nagorno-Karabakh, there's two other very, very interesting cases, which I think draw very clear parallels. And that was Sri Lanka's decision to take back, or the final success in taking back the north of Sri Lanka from the Tamil Tigers. And then what we saw in 1995, which is Croatia's end of Republika Srpska Krajina, which was a Serbian breakaway territory region in Croatia, that was essentially successful. In the course of a few days, Croat military just marched in and overthrew this attempted secession. And actually led to a really massive case of ethnic cleansing in Europe, which just really isn't talked about these days. And so I think when I saw this happen, and, you know, I tried to say, look, ideally we want to have a peaceful settlement, but let's not kid ourselves. Countries do this and they very often get away with it. But I think the real problem and the real thing that Baku has to bear in mind is that now there is a greater decision, a greater willingness of the international community, and certainly Western countries, to look at the way it was done. And, you know, as I said in the video, what it needs to be really careful about is, if it's going to do this path, it has to be super careful that it doesn't lead to mass ethnic cleansing, let alone, you know, a mass slaughter of Armenians. But as long as it can do it quickly, and it isn't so egregious that it forces the international community to act, I think what we actually see is that countries can very often do exactly what Azerbaijan did.
And so we just really have to hope that the building of the peace goes ahead. And well, let's just wish them well with that. Now, James, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. It's been absolutely delightful talking to you. I'd love to talk to you about Tokolo and Ambazonia and Biafra and all these amazing places that you bring up. But I would advise anyone to go on the Intelligent Thinking website. We'll put a link to your YouTube channel in there. You've been listening to Mark Elliott and James Ker-Lindsay on the Caspian podcast. I hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you very much.